A few months ago, I met a man who spent his entire afternoon scrolling through archival footage of a party held 50 years ago. It wasn't just any party. It was the 1971 celebration at Persepolis. Tents, designed by Parisian architects, mountains of caviar, and world leaders bowing to a king. As he watched, his expression was almost ecstatic, a strange, hungry sort of pride. "This," he whispered, pointing at a grainy image of an imperial parade, "is who we actually are, not this mess we have now." What was jarring wasn't his nostalgia, but the sheer vitriol that followed. The moment the video ended and he looked back at his current reality, the sanctions, the international isolation, the feeling of being a global pariah, his face didn't just fall. It twisted into something much sharper. It wasn't just about the money he'd lost or the inflation. It was about the deep-seated shame of a raw deal. He felt the world was laughing at his country, and that perceived humiliation had turned into a burning, radical desire to support anything, even the most extreme strongman logic, just to see those old symbols of power restored. It made me realize that we often look at radicalism, whether it's the rise of the far right in Europe, the Meiji movement in the US, or the ghost of 1930s Germany, and we try to solve it with economic charts. We look at poverty levels and trade data. But what if we're missing the real engine? What if the most dangerous force in politics isn't the lack of money, but a loss of status? According to social psychologists like Will Storr, it's not the have-nots who burn empires down, it's the used-to-haves. Those who feel they've been robbed of their seat at the table and are willing to embrace chaos if it promises to wash away their collective humiliation.
That's a really powerful story to start with, and you've articulated the core idea of this entire deep dive perfectly.
It just struck me so forcefully.
Well, it's because political volatility, radicalization, it's so often fueled not by absolute poverty, not by just being poor,
right,
but by that perceived loss, the loss of status, of dignity. We're really jumping right into what social psychologists call the politics of humiliation. It's this profound collective response to feeling, well, fundamentally insignificant.
Insignificance. It sounds like such a personal feeling, almost like a philosophical problem.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that this isn't just about individual anxiety.
No, not at all. It's more of a patterned response to these huge structural changes in society.
Okay, so before we get to the big political structures, let's maybe unpack the psychology of it first. Where does that feeling of insignificance even come from?
That's the perfect place to start, because you have to understand the personal vulnerability that populism is so good at exploiting. A psychologist named Shaw looked into this, into where this feeling originates.
And what did he find?
He basically argues that it stems from our earliest awareness as kids. You start to become aware of separation, of loss, of your own limitations.
The moment you realize you're not the center of the universe?
Exactly. You realize you're not omnipotent. You lose that early sense of what he called felt perfectibility. So we're kind of hardwired to face our own mortality and our limits, and that naturally makes us feel small. It's the baseline anxiety of just being human.
Right. So what does the brain do about it? How do we cope with that?
Well, the psychological system needs a defense. And the coping mechanism that we develop is what Shaw called narcissistic reparation.
Okay, hold on. Narcissistic reparation, that sounds clinical. Mm-hmm. But you're not talking about narcissism in the way we usually think about it, are you?
No, not in the personality disorder sense at all. Think of it more as the essential human drive to repair this feeling of being insignificant. We do it by building a personal narrative, a kind of myth about ourselves that gives our life meaning and purpose.
It's like building a psychological firewall.
That's a great way to put it. You construct an identity, an internal story that tells you you're valuable, that you belong to something important.
And these stories, they're not just about us, right? They're about our family, our religion, our job.
Precisely. They affirm your membership in a group or a community. They give you a set of ideals to live up to. And when that internal myth, that shield, gets threatened, that's when you feel this deep existential panic.
And that's where it becomes a political problem, when our personal fears meet these structural realities of modern life that are just constantly chipping away at that story we tell ourselves.
Exactly. So let's talk about those triggers. Where does the modern world, our big cities, our globalized reality, where does it start to manufacture this sense of insignificance on a massive scale?
Let's start with just living in a city.
Okay, so you can go back to George Simmel's classic work on this. He looked at how living in these huge impersonal metropolises literally changes our psychology. He saw that city life frees you from those traditional intimate social ties of a small town, But it also leads to what he called a loss or diminution of individuality. When you're just one face in a crowd of indifferent strangers, you can start to feel like an interchangeable object.
The indifference of a million people is a powerful thing. It's like a constant, quiet reminder that you're just one of many, replaceable.
And that feeling of being a commodity is then mirrored in our work lives. Most of us spend our careers in these large bureaucratic organizations. You're a cog in a massive machine. And if you don't get concrete evidence of success, if you don't feel recognized...
If your job is just boring and repetitive.
Right. You feel helpless. You feel disillusioned. And that's a huge source of that feeling of insignificance. It's the structural root of burnout, or even bore-out, which is that exhaustion you get from being chronically understimulated.
That's already a pretty grim picture, but the digital age has just supercharged this whole dynamic, hasn't it? It's not just the crowd on the street anymore.
No. Now you have what Carlos Strenger called the global celebrity effect. He wrote this book, The Fear of Insignificance, and he diagnosed this widespread fear among the global educated class people who are, objectively successful, that their lives are meaningless.
And the culprit is basically social media and the 24/7 news cycle. The constant comparison engine.
It is a constant comparison engine. Think about it. Traditionally, you measured yourself against your neighbors, your peers in your town. If you were the best baker in the village, you'd achieved significance.
You had status.
You had status. But now, because we live in this hyper-connected global village, we compare everything, our jobs, our houses, our vacations, against the world's most significant people.
Yeah.
A global 0.0001%.
And it's a competition you can't win. No matter how well you're doing, you could be a respected doctor or a successful manager. You look at the media and you're just light years away from what society is now holding up as significant.
It's an unwinnable comparison. And Strenger argues this creates highly unstable self-esteem for almost everybody. Even real high achievers are constantly afraid they're insignificant when they're judged by these globalized, idealized standards.
So it's this mass anxiety, this status anxiety, as Aline de Botton called it.
Exactly. The chronic worry about being judged a failure. And de Botton said this is a toxic but inevitable side effect of societies that promise unlimited potential to everyone.
Which is the ultimate paradox of modern capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Society tells you that you can be anything, but then it puts you in these giant impersonal systems and forces you into a competition that's impossible to win.
That connects directly to what the philosopher Erich Fromm was talking about. He argued that in modern capitalist societies, this feeling of powerlessness comes from being subordinated to what he called extrapersonal ends.
Meaning you're not working for yourself or your community.
You're working for profit's sake, for the growth of the system. The very machine you helped build turns you into its servant. You lose your sense of self-determination, and with it, your dignity.
Okay, so we've got this psychological vulnerability, and then we have these huge structural forces, urban anonymity, bureaucratic work, global comparison, that are stripping away our sense of worth.
Yeah.
So let's now get to the political trigger, the experience of not just anxiety, but actual loss status.
Yes. That shift from anxiety to actual loss is the real accelerant. Losing your status, being demoted socially, professionally, culturally, that is a profound collective humiliation, and it is driving political movements all over the world.
And that brings us to a specific group that's really feeling this shock. The displaced professional class. I came across this story about a journalist, a man named Julian, which I think illustrates this perfectly.
Okay.
So he was a veteran journalist, spent 30 years at a prestigious London news desk. His whole identity was built on this belief in hard work, in education, in so-called objective reporting. He really believed in the meritocratic dream.
And that narrative that the system rewards competence and loyalty, that's absolutely central to the self-worth of the professional middle class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But over the last decade, he watched as the standards he believed in they were swapped out for what he called performative metrics. The whole currency changed.
So he wasn't fired?
No, not fired, but sidelined, ignored in meetings. He was made to feel like a relic from an unenlightened era because he didn't, get the new cultural codes. And for him, this wasn't just a career setback. It was a deep collective humiliation for his entire class.
I can see that. That feeling of being devalued by the very institutions you helped build, that's a powerful political catalyst. You feel betrayed.
So what did Julian do? He basically chose a kind of political exile. He moved to a small town and started reading only niche conservative sources. For him, the erosion of those clear merit-based ladders in media and academia was the last straw. His status anxiety turned into a political realignment.
And his story is central to understanding the political shifts happening in the US and Europe, where, your education level is becoming more important than your economic class.
Right, the education cleavage. Let's dig into that a little bit.
A political scientist, Michael Bang-Peterson, his work shows that education has really replaced traditional indicators like income as the main political dividing line. In a globalized world, the highly educated tend to do better.
And crucially, this highly educated class has increasingly aligned itself with minority groups, racial, ethnic, sexual minorities, who are also, at the same time, increasing their status and visibility.
Yes, and so the established elite are sort of leveraging their cultural and educational capital to make space for these new groups. And that inherently challenges the old status hierarchy.
And the challenge is aimed right at the moral and cultural status of the groups who used to be central. People with maybe less formal education, or those who just feel displaced by these new emerging groups.
And that perceived status threat pushes them towards the political right. For anyone experiencing that downward mobility or even just stagnation, a social psychologist named Leah Hartwich says it's an overwhelming threat to their self-worth.
Why is that threat so particularly sharp in modern Western countries?
Because the dominant story we tell ourselves in these societies is one of radical individualism, meritocracy. The idea is, if you fail, it's your own fault.
So if you fall behind, the system implies it's because you didn't work hard enough or you weren't smart enough.
Exactly. It's a moral judgment. And that judgment translates directly and very powerfully into this deep personal shame.
And shame is the perfect psychological trigger for finding an external enemy.
It is the absolute best fuel for populist mobilization, because instead of asking people to question the unequal economic system that created the problem in the first place, right-wing populists deflect that shame completely. They identify liberal elites and marginalized groups as the real enemies of the people.
The message is, you're not a failure. You were betrayed.
Precisely. And it's a masterful strategy because it avoids talking about economic inequality directly. It reorganizes the entire political conflict along cultural lines. It protects the source of your self-worth, your identity, your values, while leaving the unequal economic system that benefits the wealthy completely untouched.
Which brings us to this thing you always hear in political commentary, the anti-system paradox. People say the anti-establishment feeling is now the right wing. But then critics point out, wait a minute, the right is overwhelmingly in favor of core systems, capitalism, the military, the police. How does that make sense?
The paradox disappears when you realize that the right's anti-systemic feeling is actually a fight for the old system.
Make America great again.
Exactly. It's explicitly backward-looking, an appeal to an idealized, status-secure past. They aren't against systems in general. They're against the current version of them, the complex, bureaucratic, liberal institutions like elite universities or global organizations that they feel deny them their moral worth and dignity.
So they're anti-status quo, but they're intensely pro-nom, a different, older system that gave them stability and recognition. It's a fight against what they see as cultural degradation, not against capital itself.
That's it. It speaks to all this sociological work on symbolic boundaries. Michelle Lamont's research shows how working-class men draw these really strong moral boundaries against groups they feel are looking down on them, all to preserve their own sense of significance.
And we can't really have this conversation without talking about the sheer scale of economic inequality today, this second Gilded Age we're in.
No, you have to connect it to what you could call the billionaire culture war nexus. The fact that you have these immense wealth disparities creates a huge structural vulnerability for the elite. If the public ever truly united around the problem of economic inequality,
the whole system that benefits the ultra-rich would be under threat.
It would be seriously threatened.
Okay.
So if you're extremely wealthy, how do you prevent that? How do you maintain political gridlock and keep people distracted?
You fuel the culture wars.
You fuel the culture wars by funding these battles through think tanks, media outlets, political campaigns. You shift the entire focus away from economics. You take that legitimate pain and status anxiety we've been talking about, and you weaponize it against cultural elites and marginalized groups.
So the culture war becomes a kind of a political shield.
A highly effective one.
Yeah.
It protects the fundamental economic system that created the inequality in the first place. And it works because for many people, the feeling of being respected and dignified, the restoration of status, is a much stronger motivator than, a rational calculation of their material benefit.
Okay, so that whole section was really about the used to haves, the professionals and their allies feeling betrayed. I want to shift now to the younger generation. We're moving from status erosion to something else, an existential crisis for young people who feel like they never had status to begin with.
That's a crucial transition. We're shifting from the politics of humiliation, which is about losing status, to the structure of modern life that prevents a stable status or community from ever forming in the first place. It's a state sociologist called anomie.
This makes me think of another story, this one about a young man named Mark in the American Midwest. He lived in one of those sprawling, anonymous suburbs. There was no traditional community glue. His parents were divorced. The local church was closed. The whole neighborhood was built for cars, not for people.
He's facing a structural void. When those traditional institutions, family, church, stable jobs, community clubs, when they dissolve, your sense of self just becomes terrifyingly fragile.
And to cope with that feeling of being a ghost, of being totally anonymous, Mark went online and found a radical identity group. He adopted this really intense, aggressive pride and a very narrow identity. It was a form of defensive narcissism.
He was the only thing that gave him a sense of we, a sense of belonging, a poor substitute for the real community he never had.
So his politics were really just a symptom of a much deeper hunger for recognition.
That's a textbook example of how the breakdown of community creates this state of normlessness, pushing people into extreme identity politics as a desperate attempt to create meaning. And this takes us right back to Emil Durkheim.
Durkheim. He defined anomy as the disease of a society that's lost its moral and legal rules, right? A state of normlessness.
Exactly. He coined the term back in the 19th century in response to the chaos of industrialization. But the concept is maybe more relevant today than ever before.
Why is that?
Because the changes we're living through are so comprehensive. Durkheim was looking at sharp, predictable changes like an economic boom or bust. But another sociologist, Robert Merton, he extended the idea. He argued that anomy isn't just a crisis state, it can be a routine, structural feature of a system.
So how did Merton define that, a routine state of anomy?
For Merton, it comes from a fundamental contradiction in society. There's this huge gap between the culturally valued goals, like in the US, the almost religious worship of wealth, and the limited legitimate ways you have to achieve those goals.
So if society tells you that being super rich is the only thing that matters, but then blocks most of the paths to get there,
then the authority of the legitimate paths, hard work, education, it starts to crumble. And that fosters fraud, crime, all sorts of prescribed behavior as people look for illegitimate ways to get the success that culture demands of them.
Okay, so Durkheim saw it as a breakdown of rules during a transition. Merton saw it as a structural failure of opportunity. But for Mark's generation, it feels like both at once, a true structural void.
Absolutely. The structural problems facing young people today are unprecedented. A writer named Lascano Trevin calls them the hollow generation. They're facing a severe crisis of entry into adult life.
You see it everywhere. Youth unemployment is high, graduate programs are cut, and even entry-level jobs are being reclassified as non-essential or just replaced by software.
And so that traditional blueprint for becoming an adult, the one that's been the social contract for 70 years,
it's broken.
That blueprint education leads to a stable job, leads to independence, leads to adulthood. It's collapsed. Young people were told to invest everything in expensive, specialized education, take on huge debt, and now they find that the degree doesn't guarantee the job or the status that was promised. It creates a deep, visceral feeling of betrayal.
You did everything you were told to do, you played by the rules, and then you find out the game board has been cleared.
Exactly. And this leads us back to a deeper philosophical point from Durkheim about freedom itself. We tend to think freedom is just the absence of constraints.
Right. Total freedom is the goal.
But Durkheim argued that regulation and limits are actually what make freedom bearable. They're what give our effort meaning. If the goalposts are always moving or just removed entirely, a life without constraints doesn't feel liberating. It feels unstable, agitating, and meaningless.
So in the name of giving everyone maximum choice, we've actually removed the obligations and the structures that give life meaning. We haven't liberated the youth. We've abandoned them to create their own meaning in a vacuum.
And that abandonment is a denial of what the philosopher Hannah Arendt's called action.
Okay, what did she mean by action?
For Arendt, action is different from just labor, surviving or work building things. Action is about appearing to one another in public, taking responsibility, becoming a someone in the eyes of others. And that requires public structures. It requires stakes.
And when careers are just a series of temporary gigs that don't ask anything meaningful of you.
You are denied the conditions for action. You can't become someone because there's no public stage that demands your responsible presence. You're left just scrambling for gigs and building a digital profile.
So you're forced to create meaning privately. And if you feel useless to society, that sense of worthlessness is just ripe for exploitation by any radical movement that comes along and promises you a meaningful role.
A role of action, no matter how destructive. And this vacuum is the perfect breeding ground for extreme, unpredictable behavior. Which brings us to a newer concept, reflexive anomy.
Reflexive anomy. Okay, let's define that clearly.
So structural anomy, the way Merton defined it, is a pretty predictable response to the system being unfair. Reflexive anomy it's a concept for the 21st century. It's a deeply subjective, non-linear reaction to the world generated at the micro level through radical self-organization.
What does that actually look like?
The key change is a shift in authority. In traditional anomy, you break the rules because the system is rigged. In reflexive anomy, the entire decision-making center shifts to the individual. Your own self-reflection becomes the ultimate authority for what is true and what is right.
So if I believe my subjective truth, and there are no shared external moral guardrails, then my action is justified, no matter how antisocial it is.
Precisely. It gives the individual this invincible confidence, but with zero protection from error or from, dangerous delusion. This is the mechanism behind some of the most shocking acts of violence we've seen, like from someone like Anders Breivik. Their actions are based entirely on their own self-reflection, completely detached from any shared social values.
The individual is cut loose, empowered by freedom, but without any accountability.
And this leads directly to what Carlo Bertolo calls mandatory identity. Society no longer assigns you a status based on your birth or your job. Now you have mandatory self-identification. The entire immense effort of figuring out who you are and maintaining that identity falls on you, the individual.
That sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
And you're doing it without the meta-protection, as you called it, of religion or a stable community. Identity has become a full-time, high-stakes job.
And in a hyper-individualistic world where success is defined by visibility, being invisible is the ultimate nightmare. You see narcissistic trends rising because self-worth is sought by showcasing an idealized self for public approval online, rather than through the hard work of improving your real self.
So when you're denied that status and attention, violence, or an extreme act becomes a guaranteed way to get noticed, it's a form of revenge for being left out.
The whole competitive fight for attention drives it. The culture creates an environment where only the most extreme, individualized act can break through the noise. And the system is so fragile that even a small, subjective decision can have these huge, unpredictable consequences, all driven by that desperate search for significance.
Okay, so we've tracked this crisis from the professional feeling betrayed by meritocracy to the young person who can't even find a foothold to begin with. Now let's zoom out to the collective, national level, where the loss of status becomes national humiliation, an engine powerful enough to topple regimes.
And this is maybe the most explosive political engine of all. Collective trauma, especially the perceived humiliation of an entire country, can lead to what some call traumatic nationalism. It's the highest form of the politics of status loss.
The material I have here focuses on post-revolutionary Iran. It tells the story of a young woman in Tehran, Samira, who wasn't even alive before the 1979 revolution. But she secretly keeps these photos of her grandmother from the 70s, in a miniskirt at a jazz club.
And for her, that's not about longing for a dictator.
Not at all. It's a clinical, psychological response to her present reality, which is defined by international isolation and a total collapse of institutional legitimacy.
The contrast between that memory and her reality is brutal. When your nation's present feels like a dead, end-sanctioned, ostracized, losing influence, you reach back into a mythic golden age to try and restore your sense of collective national honor. That's how this monarchist nostalgia can actually function as a rational response to humiliation.
And this mechanism, restoring dignity through a kind of historical memory, it has some chilling precedents, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just think about Germany after World War I. The country felt crushed by the deep national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, compounded by economic collapse. Hitler's entire rise was fueled by his promises to restore lost greatness and status.
That loss of status created the fertile ground for radicalization.
Exactly. Humiliation, as Sociologists like Evelyn Lindner argue it's a socially generated emotion. It's produced when you perceive that your equal dignity has been denied. And when that denial happens to a whole group, the subjective experience is that pervasive feeling of insignificance.
So whether it's an individual journalist or an entire nation, the core emotional driver is the same: the loss of dignity.
And in the case of Iran, you see nostalgia being used as a psychological defense. One writer, Nazari, defines nostalgia as past regret. It inherently involves a negation of the present and a revolution against existing patterns by idealizing and ritualizing a distant, pure past.
So let's look at what they're trying to negate. Before 1979, under the Shah, Iran was aggressively positioned as this secular, modern, influential power.
That whole era was defined by these intense efforts to instill national pride. The 1971 celebration at Persepolis, the event your friend was watching, that was a monumental theatrical effort to legitimize the Shah's rule by connecting it to Iran's deep imperial roots while also showing off its modern resurgence. It was a massive projection of status.
But the 1979 revolution replaced that secular nationalism with a revolutionary religious ideology. And that led to decades of international isolation, sanctions, and this profound perceived status gap on the world stage.
Precisely. The policies of the Islamic Republic have resulted in what many Iranians feel is a fundamental national humiliation. So the growing popularity of these pre-revolutionary symbols, monarchist figures, the ancient Achaemenid Empire, it's a mechanism to try and restore that lost feeling of national dignity.
It's the national version of Julian the journalist retreating into his niche conservative world. It's a retreat into a narrative where moral worth and dignity are still possible, even if that narrative is politically fraught.
It is a potent psychological and political weapon. It fills the void left by the current regime's perceived failures. Media, social media campaigns, they all reinforce this image of a glorious past, offering a vision of a proud, respected nation, a stark contrast to the current reality.
But looking to the past for political answers, especially through this idealized nostalgic lens, that comes with huge risks.
Significant risks. When you look exclusively to the past, you overlook the complexities of your current reality. The embrace of exclusionary ideologies, whether they're religious or secular nationalist, in the name of restoring status. It often leads to these dangerous cycles of authoritarianism. As Will Storr warns, these movements are powerful, but they require critical examination to avoid just repeating history's mistakes under a new banner of dignity.
This whole deep dive, it feels like we followed a single thread, from the individual psyche all the way to global politics. And the thread is that the political engine is profoundly emotional, and it's rooted in this drive to preserve or restore dignity.
We've tracked the politics of status loss across three domains, really. The educated professional feeling betrayed by meritocracy, the atomized youth searching for a radical identity to replace community, and the citizens seeking national dignity through traumatic nostalgia. The economic charts that we always look at, they often miss this emotional calculus, that feeling of being a used to have or a never will be, which is what truly fuels the most dangerous political forces.
So what's the ultimate synthesis here? How do we connect that individual drive for significance to all this macro-political turmoil?
The core conflict lies in the drive for dignity, what the Greek philosophers called thymos, that spirited part of the soul, the need for recognition and worth. And that drive is proving to be a stronger political motivator than purely rational material benefit or oikonomia.
So people will willingly sacrifice their own economic interests if a movement promises to restore their collective pride and status.
It happens all the time, and this all loops back to our hyper-individualized modern society. We have this exponential increase in personal freedom, the shift toward mandatory self-identification, subjective authority, that reflexive individuality. It's given us massive freedom. But the institutions that used to enforce social responsibility, family, community, stable careers, they've dissolved.
And without those stabilizing guardrails, freedom becomes unstable, potentially destructive.
That is the ultimate cost of status collapse. Rational choice in an unstable society is easily leveraged toward instant gratification and, crucially, the avoidance of consequences, the avoidance of responsibility. This instability manifests as unpredictable and extreme actions, all driven by the desire to reclaim a lost or denied sense of self-worth. The ultimate lesson here seems to be that if a society fails to provide predictable and meaningful paths to dignity, individuals and nations will create their own and often very dangerous substitutes.